Good morning, Mainline Parent. This is Pamela Battalato. I'm the content director and one of your admins here in the Mainline Parent Facebook community group. I'm here with Laura Swartz, our Philadelphia Family and Mainline Parent editor, as well as Rob Gent. He is the Embark Behavioral Health Chief Clinical Officer, and he has led the Embark organization in clinical development and the growth of numerous programs. We posted last week asking you to submit your questions for this live Facebook chat about the questions you might have regarding teen mental health. We asked for your questions about how to have mental health conversations with your children and teens. And here today, you'll learn how to get that help and ask for help. You'll learn about what makes Embark unique and what resources they have available, not just to teens, but to the parents helping them navigate as well. Rob, thank you so much for being here with us this morning. Laura, you as well. And we're excited to learn more about Embark and what resources you have for us to help our children navigate these difficult times. Laura?
Hi, good afternoon. So obviously this past year and a half has been abnormal in so many ways, and it's been difficult enough for adults to handle, let alone kids and teens who maybe don't have an outlet for that. Are you seeing an uptick in mental health issues? And if so, what kinds of issues have you generally seen pop up?
That is a great question. We've definitely seen an uptake. Rates of anxiety, depression, suicidality are at all-time highs. It is a tragic situation. And certainly it's hard to understand how this whole pandemic and the isolation and the relational impact, it needs to be really understood in a more functional health type of dynamic, which is really interesting for us, especially at Embark, because you can't just compartmentalize it like, oh, let's just treat the anxiety. Well, we're still dealing with relational issues. We're still dealing with interaction between other people. We're still, especially when it comes to adolescence, we'll talk a little bit of this, really the formation of the identity is really such a crucial time. And here we've had a fracture of that whole natural process. So yeah, it's probably more than you wanted, but yes, we've definitely seen an uptake.
So if we're seeing this uptick now, we know as parents, I feel like we're a little more in the know than generations prior to us about the importance of mental health help and trying to take away some of that stigma about it. When is it time to ask for help for a teen or even younger?
Many people don't like my response, but I always say anytime is the time. I mean, I really want to shift the paradigm is that we don't want to pull the fire alarm when we think the house is on fire. I mean, I'm like, oh, let's rewind it a little bit. Like we should be continually checking in. This is the part of the psychoeducation. This is part of the development. We're always seeing this process. We should be always, especially as a parent, we're always growing and learning, but we're looking for what? How we're actually creating a sense of connection. I call the term co-regulation, even with our adolescents and our teens. Those are really important, and we should be seeking that information constantly. Because the number one thing I've been doing this a while, the number one thing I see the parents struggle with is trying to differentiate what's normal behavior versus abnormal behavior. So this normative versus abnormal stuff just gets really confusing. So I always say, seek help anytime. What does that mean? It means educate yourself, parents, first. And then when we can talk about some of those indicators, when the train is really off the track and there's actually behaviors, maybe it's isolation, maybe it's anxiety that's debilitating, that are affecting everyday normal functioning, that's a time to actually then, let's move forward towards more intensive therapy. Potentially it's IOP, intensive outpatient type of stuff. But, I'm always smiling because I'm like, anytime's a good time to go see a therapist.
So basically, if we're already thinking about it, it's probably time, if not past time.
Yeah, if you're thinking about it and questioning it, and you're probably like a lot of parents, well, am I just being hypersensitive or is this normal behavior? What is curiosity versus normal adolescence? Don't let it be a mystery. Let's find out.
I like that answer.
Sorry.
Okay.
Not to make even more parents like worried, but so you talked about like the parents who are like already questioning and thinking like, is there something abnormal? Should I go to therapy? But what are maybe some non-typical warning signs that there could be a mental health issue that parents might not even be aware of, should be like raising a red flag?
Yeah, I really appreciate this question a lot because I get it quite frequently. So I always like to talk about what are these. So let's take a step back as a parent. We need to look at what relationally should be happening. And, we always want to know the big ones, right? Like, oh, my child is sneaking out at nighttime. I smell alcohol in their breath. They're smoking marijuana, whatever those things are. Yeah. Those are some really down the road big indicators. But I always like to say, look for the small things. Look for those little things. We can call them, non-typical, but I would say, look for how is their actual eye contact? Are they continually avoiding eye contact? Are they shifting around? So I always say, if there's avoidance of eye contact, or the eye contact is, I'm ticked at you, or it's stink eye, or it's stop looking at me kind of thing, this agitated, I would say, no, let's look at what is vulnerable eye contact. Can you make that? How are they with affectional touch? This is a tough one for parents because they're like, well, they're teens. They don't want to be touched anyhow. Well, that's not entirely true. When teens when they have their emotions, if they get their feelings hurt, teens are all over the place emotionally all the time. Well, there should be moments where they return. I call it returning to the secure base of mom and dad. Is there when they get their heart broken or somebody says something, is there receptivity to just even a side hug or some affectional touch? If they're withdrawing from that, that's actually pretty important. I talk about proximity too. These are good signs. If they never want to get close to you, if they never want to get close to what we call a safe vertical or a caregiving relationship, if they're always avoiding that, that's a non-typical sign like, oh, something's going on here. I like to use the term vulnerability as well. Can they access vulnerability, or are they constantly turning it away? Like, no, stop asking those questions. At some point in time, you want to access, gosh, can they be vulnerable? Or are they just so shut down that they're protecting something? And the last two I like to talk about is, one is incongruence of affect. This is a really good sign. If they're telling you, oh, this was the best day I've ever had, and their just affect is so sad, or like, they're expressing a sad story and their face isn't matching up. That something's off. We want that congruence between their emotional story, their emotional narrative as well. And the last one I find is really important for parents to see is there a rejection of empathy? Most people don't think about this. Like, if you show that adolescence and empathy, wow, if I'm you, I'm probably feeling, and they reject it. No, that's not how I'm feeling. Stop talking to me. Blah, blah, that's not how I feel. We know that when there's a rejection of empathy, a person is consumed with shame. That's key. Shame, this sense of my own sense of worth, is embroiled in all of this mental health stuff that we talk about. Shame is a core ingredient of this whole dynamic. So I don't know if that's helpful, but it's a different way to look at, boy, how do I tease this out before we're getting into these substance abuse and addiction and all these things? What can I see as the leading indicators?
Those are great things to look for, and things that I think so many of us just kind of, brush off as, oh, normal teen behavior. My son never wants to hug me, or so-and-so never, shares a story about their day, or, makes those connections. I think we're so used to just saying, oh, it's normal, then, rather than looking for help as to, just because it's normal doesn't mean there's not a problem. So I think that's important to remember.
Well, I think it's important to balance, if I can just interrupt, that normal means normal when we look at normative behavior, especially for adolescents, that they can exert some of that to find their own identity, but at times they will return to the secure base. That's normative. When they never display any of that, that's abnormal. That's important.
Mm-hmm. It's so true. So then, talking about mental illness and mental health, I think, like I said before, we are so much more aware, I feel like, than many other generations, but there's still that stigma. People are loath to admit that they might need help, or find help, or admit that their child needs help. What can parents do, in their own family, or with their children, or even in conversation among our own friends to help destigmatize that term, that mental illness, or the need for help?
Yeah, terrific question. I want to, for people, and I love to talk about this, is that in order to destigmatize it, we need to change our paradigm or how we think about it. So I like to use the term, it is mental illness, but let's talk about mental health. And if we look at this, if mental health, I always like to use the analogy of fitness. No matter where you are in this level of trying to be fit, if you're super unhealthy, and what's going to happen? You actually need to probably go seek some outside help, some professional to say, gosh, how do I get a little bit physically healthy? Well, let's change your diet. Let's give you that. You receive help. And if you go along this continuum, and we think about even professional athletes, what do they need? They have professional people that are helping them. So along this continuum, no matter if your health is terrible or your health is optimal, you're on this continuum, and people need some input from outside sources. And that's what gets stigmatized, right? That mental health gets stigmatized because you're not capable. You need some outside input. You don't have the skill set, or somehow you have this moral failing, right? Because you need some mental health assistance to improve that. Well, I'm saying, let's change the paradigm. How many food nutritional gurus are out there? How many podcasts can you listen to? How many things are out there? People talking, you're like, here's how breath work. Here's what you can do for breathing. Here's how you can do how many people have a Peloton, have watched the commercial and have a Peloton in their house to improve their fitness? Well, I'd love to change the paradigm and say, look, mental health is not a moral failing. We all exist on the continuum somewhere. And development is about improving that mental health, that mental fitness. I love to use the term mental fitness because it really helps to change people. Then say, oh, yeah, I'm trying to get fit. So one is changing the paradigm. We're not all functioning on our best optimal mental health. Just like how many people are not in their optimal physical health. How many people have really poor diets? And it's causing all kinds of, we could talk about that gut microbiome, the gut-brain axis all day long. People with poor diets and poor physical health are not functioning mentally optimally. So guess what? We have some deficiencies. So I know that's a lot, but destigmatizing it is really about changing the paradigm and having compassion. It's not a moral failing. We all exist on the continuum. We all want to improve it.
So I guess going off of that, how can parents kind of help themselves maybe develop a toolkit and that language you're talking about that they might not be familiar with because maybe they grew up in a different generation where mental health just wasn't talked about, and also kind of deal with, accepting it for themselves. Like I feel like it might be less stigmatized in the younger generation than in ours. So maybe what we're talking about really is dealing with kind of like the secondary mental health issues of, oh my God, my child needs to get mental health care. So I guess it's kind of a complex question. There's a couple questions there, but
so you're asking
themselves.
if I'm a parent and I've had this cultural stigmatized thing, what do I even do for me? Because it seems like we have more understanding and compassion for our children than we do ourselves when it comes to mental health. I think that's a fair point. So yeah, certainly as a parent, we can certainly take a step back. We have all these responsibilities. I think it's important to even start to understand is, what is these terms? What is anxiety? What is depression? Because so much of the stigmatization is a lack of understanding of what those things are. Guess what? A certain level of stress is necessary. we even stigmatize stress, right? No, we don't want any stress. No stress, blah, blah, blah. Actually, stress is important. Gravity causes stress. We need a certain amount of pressure and stress in our lives to be healthy. When that becomes overwhelming, then that's when it becomes overwhelming stress. That stress turns into anxiety. Lots of people don't even know. I love to talk to the terms. I love to say to people, hey, parents, what's the difference between anxiety and depression? Most people don't know. And I say, oh, let's talk about this. Depression is about the past. Anxiety is about the future. What are you worried about? They oftentimes go hand in hand, and many parents will be like, oh, I'm constantly worried about the future. Is my kid going to school? Are they doing this or this? I'm constantly absorbed in that. And then what? Boy, I want to eat a lot of carbs, or I want to go have a pizza. I want to go and soothe myself with ice cream. And pretty soon, the parent is trying to what? Kick in all this dopamine and endorphins through these maladaptive ways. And pretty soon we have our own issues. So what I'm saying is that's super normal stuff. So as a parent, let's just be honest. It's hard to, but let's look at ourselves. Wow, do I get hyper-focused on stuff? Am I experiencing overwhelming stress? That is normal, especially in our society with, what the pandemic's created. How many parents are worried about, their kids going to school, the economy, what's happening with jobs and all this stuff? Oh my gosh, it's very stressful. So what I'm saying is, as a parent, wow, how do I educate myself? Realize that all of us have a certain amount of stress. How we cope with that stress is very normal. We're all looking to improve that. We're all on the continuum somewhere. Even myself, I'm a parent. I know that, wow, I get way too over anxious and I worry about stuff. What do I need to do? I've learned to, I listen to podcasts. I do stuff. I need to make sure that I get up and I walk and I breathe and I do basic functional health things to keep me grounded. And actually, that's the best role modeling I can do for my child. Interesting how pretty soon those two start to go together, right? My child always sees my hair on fire. What's going to happen to them? Oh,
Yeah,
I don't know if I answered your question, but
yeah,
that's a really good point.
I think kids definitely pick up on that and they feed off of that. So yeah.
We do have a couple of our followers that are submitting questions as we're here chatting. And one parent commented and said, and taking us back to one of the first questions we asked and talking about the non-typical warning signs. And they said, wow, Rob just made me sit back in my seat with his comments about how the rejection of empathy can be a lead indicator of shame and stress for adolescents. Can you talk a little more about that? I guess that specifically that rejection of empathy. And I think personally, I've seen that as well. Sometimes when we notice our kids having a problem, my husband and I might try to share a story about, something that happened to us in a very similar vein, either in our current lives or when we were their ages or younger. And they're like, no, that's not it. Or, oh, here comes another dad's story, and they don't want to hear about it. And, what is that a warning sign of, and why is that rejection of empathy such a concerning indicator?
Yeah, I'm glad you're reaching out about this question. So empathy has a few parts to it. So I would say as a parent that empathy is only as effective as the parent or the person giving the empathy is predictable and reliable. This is important. Empathy is only as effective as the person is who's providing empathy. I'm just repeating that is predictable, reliable, and safe. I always say, have you ever tried to receive empathy from somebody who you don't trust? And people are like, how does that feel? It feels awful. So as a parent, we can say, oh, I've got some homework to do. One is if my child's coming in and I want to check in with them and use some empathy. Now I'm going to build on this. Empathy is the only antidote from shame. Let me get a little kudos to Brene Brown. Empathy is the only antidote to shame, but we have to know how to give effective empathy. So as a parent, one is I'm going to say, don't fix it. If you go in with strategy, you've lost. Empathy before strategy. Please, please, please remember this little cliche. Empathy before strategy. How many of you have ever been hurting, or I always like to use the analogy, if you've lost someone close to you and you're at the funeral and somebody comes up to you and they give you platitudes and try to fix it. What does that feel like? Oh, there. Time will heal the wounds. You're like, I'm going to punch you in the face. I don't want to hear that right now. That's not empathy. That feels so horrible. Like you're totally disconnected. So what I'm saying is empathize before we strategize. Parents, we want to fix it for our children because their pain is our pain. We want to move to a fix, and we're really good fixers. If you can, refrain from that, because empathy in first person language, say, hey, if I'm you, I always say, don't would or should. if I'm you, I would, or if I you, I should. No, no, no. Say, if I'm you, this is what I'm feeling. Because if you get it wrong, what's the child going to say to you? That's not how I feel. Great. Let me ask you, how do you feel? Now we've started a dialogue. That's fantastic. So one is, as a parent, don't fix it. Don't do that. Set it aside and say, listen, man, if I'm you, my only agenda right now is not to fix it, is just to hold the emotions. Holding emotions in their entirety is much harder than moving to cognitive fixing. Most parents struggle with that.
I do. I'm a fixer. Anybody who calls or texts me or tells me they have some kind of issue, that's my first, reaction is, okay, you came to me to tell me this, you must want my help. You must want me to help you fix it, or for me to fix it for you, especially my kids. So this is a whole change in how I'm going to do like every single thing. Wow,
it's hard because the actual fix is to hold it, to go to their deepest, darkest places of shame. If I can hold your worthlessness, if I can hold together, we can hold your shame. Guess what we do? We actually trick the brain and we change the neural synaptic connections around it. We actually change the meaning, the experience of being worthless and alone. If I can share your shame, I've changed it. I've tricked you, and now it's less painful, and now we can share it together. Isn't that crazy?
That is crazy.
If I just strategize around it, I don't change it. I don't hold it. I just try to cover it up and avoid it.
Wow. I feel like I felt that in my whole heart.
Me too. Yeah.
Right? As a parent, as a mom, you want to fix things, but if I'm just sharing that emotion with you, I'm making a bigger impact than by just, fixing that problem. Another question that came in that I thought was a really good one. It says, my teens or tweens do not want to ask for help at school, even when they really need it. It stresses them out almost every day. Any advice or how to help navigate them through this? So those words we can give to our kids about how to find the help that they know they need but can't ask for.
Yeah, this is a tricky one. I wish we
probably do a whole half hour just on this one.
Well, knowing is different than feeling, right? I mean, I like to talk about our rational brains. We want those talking to our emotional brains and our bodies really well, but oftentimes what we know that it's called a lid flip, that actually what we know isn't always in line with what we're feeling. And so even though kids can know, so this is where what's really hard is as we grow, kids need that empathy to be able to say, wow, if I'm you, I'm getting overwhelmed, I need this help. We need to label it for them to know what help they need. Is it emotional help? They need that experience with us to say, wow, if I'm you right now and I'm sitting in school, I'm feeling what? I'm feeling alone. I'm feeling not adequate. I'm feeling overwhelmed. I'm feeling worried, and that worriedness, or I'm feeling these social pressures. I want to connect. I'm feeling like if we have to label it, it's called name it to tame it. We have to give it words because the kids often don't know what they know they should ask for help, but we're not entirely sure what those feelings are and what's going on with me. And there's probably a little bit of embarrassment. If I need help, like that's embarrassing, but what is embarrassment and shame? So we as a parent, what can we do is, again, I'm going to say, don't try to fix it until we empathize. If we can empathize, and here I'm going to go on further. If we can empathize and get those indicators, I'm going to call them indicators of co-regulation, the eye contact, the affectional touch, the proximity, the vulnerability, the congruence of that. If we can get all those things, you know that your child then is actually what we call co-regulating with you. It's called co-regulation. Once we get co-regulation, then they're able to hold on to that and say, wow, I feel so cared about and so valuable that now I can then have the self-worth to try to go ask for help at school. Because now we can get into terms like resiliency. Resiliency, how many of us are familiar with that term, resiliency? We want our kids to be resilient. Well, guess what? We have a deficit of resiliency in our society right now. We have a horrible deficit of resiliency. And what is that about? That's all about the development of the self. And that comes in the context is associated with this whole relational experience. So kids, adolescents, they need the security of relationship, develop their sense of self to then go ask for help and know that, you know what, if this doesn't turn out the way I planned, or so I don't get the help, guess what? I'm going to be okay. I'm not going to fall apart. These are great questions.
We have a great community.
Yeah.
So I guess we've sort of touched on this a little bit, but right now, even though many things are beginning to get back to normal, whatever that is, or maybe because of it, what kind of long-term effects can we expect to see from the prolonged period of isolation that we've experienced? And some kids, like, maybe are going back to school for the first time in, a year. What should we expect?
Yeah, this period has been really tricky, because when we look at, I'm going to use the term our neurobiology. We have to understand that, our emotions, our thinking brain, our feeling brain, and our bodies are all talking to each other. And when those stop talking to each other is when we really get this deficit of mental health. That's important. So now if we take that in context and look at what really hasn't been strengthened. So during that time of COVID, some of the long-term effects we're going to see is that, especially for adolescents, the interaction, I like to talk about this, the interaction on screen time or devices with others got intensified and reinforced. Mm-hmm. The problem with that is that our brains long to grow contextually, meaning that our brains long to be in actual experiences of interaction with other human beings. So I always talk about, like, our brains, if you looked at a small child, is it more optimal for their development to go out on a playground and climb on a gym and interact with other kids and play tag and do all that? Or sit and look at a screen, one-dimensional screen, and try to develop in that way? Our brains and our bodies and our emotions long for that context, because there's multiple forms coming in. The problem is with COVID, lots of our kids got more screen time, and we did our best to try to encourage other peer interaction, but that was all reinforced through the screen time. It actually produced this, what we call incongruence between, I don't want to get too technical, but the ideal versus the real self. Think about FaceTime, think about all of your friends and the likes. That whole social media platform inflates our ideal sense of self, and it doesn't reinforce our real sense of self or what we actually experience of ourselves with others. That's where identity formation forms. The problem, part of that long-term effect is that we get locked into what? How are we socially performing? That's my identity. That's my sense of security. And if I don't have 1,000 likes on whatever, I'm just going to get more anxious, because now my worth is at jeopardy and I'm not as worthy as somebody else. So the long-term effects is we're seeing a rise in anxiety. We're seeing a rise of depression. We're seeing a rise of self-injurious behavior. Why are we seeing all this? Because we're seeing a disconnection between the actual social interaction that we actually long for from peers, from others. That is important to. One is to give us a real sense of, think about growing up as a kid. You got praise for stuff, right? Oh, you're such a good gymnast. You're such a good soccer player. That's great. And then at the same time, you go home and what? Your parents will be like, no, you need to clean your room. You do this. So you get this accurate dose of humility and discipline with praise. And that helped to develop your sense of identity. It took a village. Now, what are we looking at? That one side has been taken away. Oftentimes we're just getting screen time, connection. That's what's important. We haven't had this other side. So unfortunately, some of the long-term effects are we're going to see an increase of anxiety. We're going to see an increase of a lack of self-development, where I feel a sense of, oh, I can be grounded. I can trust relationships. I know that I'm going to be okay. We're becoming more fragile as a society. Mm-hmm. Why is that? Because we could get into it, but especially our Western society, we're really driven by what we call a hedonic sense of pleasure. We don't know suffering. We don't know. We don't spend time in the state of like, oh, what does suffering mean? Am I able to really challenge myself? Is there resiliency? What does relationship look like? Unfortunately, we're moving into a place of, boy, I just want this instant gratification, and it's really taken a toll on us. So that was a long way around, but long-term effects, they're pretty real, but there's a way we can mitigate it, honestly.
So I'm just thinking about, how to kind of talk a little bit more about Embark and what do you do at Embark Behavioral Health, and what kind of sets your services apart from other places? When parents are looking for a resource to call, why call Embark? What makes what you guys do there special?
Yeah, Pamela, I appreciate that question. I've spent a lot of time looking in and doing the research around, I use the term looking at relationship, but looking at development and the impact of what we call interpersonal development. Really, how does relationship impact our sense of development? We can talk about early developmental trauma. We can talk about a lot of things that happen. So what Embark does is we want to look at the entire child, what's happening cognitively, emotionally, physically, but also how that child exists within systems. So we're all part of systems. So if you think about that adolescent, if they're having a hard time, they're not having a hard time necessarily in a vacuum, right? They're part of another system, and the parents and siblings and all that are all part of this system. So one is, we're looking at this, Embark does things differently, is one is we're looking at the neurobiological health of the child and overall functional health. We'll talk about that in a second, but we're also treating the system. So when I talk about this, I mean, we can talk about some of the stats. Is we know that, like, when we look at just treating alcohol or short-term addiction treatment, the recidivism rate, it takes an average of 8 times of treatment before it starts to take root. That is staggering and awful. That's an awful statistic that it takes 8 times. Why is that? Because oftentimes you go and get treatment for a short period of time, but you're thrust back into that same environment that you were at before. That same environment is moving. It's a system that has a ton of gravity. Imagine, it's hard for a child to resist that momentum, getting plucked back into that same environment. So at Embark, we want to say, we need to change the system. We need to help change the system, at the same time changing that system to really impact that individual adolescent too. I mean, gosh, let's talk about, I mean, I'm big on this, but even nutritional health, to movement, to looking at, gosh, how much movement are we getting? Do we even understand what we call neurotransmitters? How much dopamine is, adrenaline versus cortisol? All this plays a dynamic in our actual functional health. I mean, I've been treating kids for a while, and I always say to parents, how is it talking to your child at the end of the day when they've survived on a bag of Cheetos and an Oreo? And many parents will be like, oh, that's my diet too. I sucked down a Starbucks and had a Snickers bar. I'm like, well, how are you performing? And you're crabby, you don't want to talk, you don't want to be vulnerable. I don't want anybody to touch me. So all of a sudden, even our nutritional intake is impacting our mental health. So in Embark, we do things differently. We want to really look at this holistically, because oftentimes we set people up for failure just to change the way we think. And we know it's much more complicated than just the way you think. Because how many people, really, really smart people, are struggling emotionally, but they can tell you and write the book, but their lives are still a mess. At Embark, we want to do it differently. And we know how to do it differently.
Just to wrap up, I know someone had pointed out to us that September is National Suicide Prevention Month. And I just thought it would be wise to share with our audience any resources that you think are important for them to have on hand in case we happen to miss some of these early signs, or the signs weren't there at all and we're now desperately in need of crisis intervention. Where do we go for that? What's the first call for a family in that situation?
Yeah, so we always want to err on the side of caution, right? So if you see some sort of self-injurious behavior, if there is an actual suicide attempt, please go to the local hospital, go to the ER. They have ability for a psychiatrist to do a quick psychiatric assessment. There's inpatient care. There's lots of ways to do triage on this behavior. I mean, our physical health is so essential. So one is, there's crisis hotlines, suicide crisis hotlines. A group even like this is really great. I always tell parents, if you suspect that all of those things, those indicators we talked about, but you're seeing what? Scratches on the wrist. You're seeing, I would even ask if you're suspicious of your child, like, kids are clever. They'll start cutting and doing things in places you can't see. And so now you're, as a parent, you're like, oh, it's up in the inner thigh where the shorts cover. And this, I didn't even know they were self-harming. I didn't even know that. Well, it's important to ask, but then it's important to what? Seek some psychoeducation, to look out for, who is a counselor I can call. There's lots of virtual telehealth these days. If for some reason you can't get out, or the psychiatrist is booked, well, hey, let's call up. Embark happens to have a virtual online platform. There's a number of other ones, Talkspace and that type of stuff, that they can quickly get you some professional input. But one is, take care of the immediacy. You're going to have to do triage if you're a parent. If there's a suicidal attempt, if there's some sort of self-injurious behavior, that type of stuff, boy, please call a crisis hotline, call somebody yeah, I mean, going to a hospital and those things can be super overwhelming and shame-producing, frankly. So, go ahead.
Right. I think in those situations, where you are worried as a parent where there might be an attempt, maybe you found a journal, or you happen to catch a glimpse, of what you think might be some, scars or something from self-harm, where they might not be in need of medical attention because they're not, currently, maybe suffering from an overdose or something, but you worry that those things might happen, or, you have a child who's, adverse to the idea of getting help. I think, that's when it becomes a little harder to get the help. So having those resources is something, most people don't know they need until it's too late.
Right. So if you suspect those things, I mean, we would love to help you certainly get the resources to get a professional. But I always say to parents, you have some ability to be effective, even in the way that you approach this. If you suspect, don't be accusatory and angry. Be curious, be empathetic. That's going to help shift them into being more vulnerable. Like, yeah, I am struggling with this. I am. Because even if you get the help, adolescents are really tricky, or teens. Are you going to drag them? Are you going to force them into it? Sometimes we have to, but if we can come alongside them and create an alliance and have them feel cared about, then we can get them to have some buy-in. Because then they acknowledge their own suffering rather than hiding it because of us as the parent. That's a challenging place to be as a parent and as a child. So
yeah, exactly. I think
there's things you can do as a parent, for sure.
Laura, did you have any other questions that you wanted to make sure we included here? Otherwise, I think we've made it through our list of questions that we had prepared in advance and ones that have been submitted during our talk. Actually, I think I see Sarah typing to me right now. Yeah. How do you find the right fit for a therapist? I'm reading it as she's typing it. I think it's a copy and paste from our community group. Yeah. So I was about to wrap up, but I think this might just be one real quick one we can answer before we say goodbye for the afternoon. I think someone was just asking, how do you find the right fit for a therapist if your teen is rejecting the idea of going to therapy or finding some help?
I'm smiling. This is probably the most relevant question I get all the time, because all therapists are not the same. All therapists are not practicing the same. Some are going to be. So the first recommendation is start calling around. You're going to have to call around. And remember, you're interviewing them. You're giving them business. And I always say, ask the therapist what is your modality or what is your orientation to therapy? What do you do? If they tell you I'm strictly cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, like, okay, that's an approach, but how are you going to be able to be relationally focused and relationally attuned with my adolescent? Because guess what adolescents need? They want playfulness. They want interaction. They want to see congruence. They want to know you're there without the agenda is to get them healthy. Yes, but they want to know that you're present. And I use the term attuned. So if you're calling around, ask them, what is your orientation to therapy? What modality do you practice? What kind of therapy are you going to do on my child? How do you feel about family therapy? This is key. Do you incorporate the family? Do you suggest that a family, now we're looking at it systemically because we're going to get the child help, but I would be cautious if they're just going to do all individual therapy with your child and not incorporate you. I would say that's a little bit of a warning sign because you want to integrate that together. So one is feel like you have the right to interview them and ask them questions. What does an average session look like? I would ask that question. What are you going to ask the question? What do you do if my child shuts down in therapy? How do you handle that? You're going to turn the screws and try to punish them and do more? No. Wow, I'm going to take them out. I'm going to take them for a walk. I'm going to bring in a canine. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. Great. Those are more, adolescents especially want to have engagement that is more appealing to them, that it's more personal to them, that it's more, I use the term playfulness. Kids like that. I mean, we like that as an adult. I mean, we want the quick solutions, but adolescents in particular, they have a good way of sizing people up, right?
Yeah, they do. And their first, sometimes their first thoughts about somebody are pretty spot on, or even if they're not, it's hard to get them to change their opinion of somebody once they have it. I have one kid who, he would not be willing to do, any kind of therapy in a traditional sense. Sometimes he has a knee injury. I have trouble even getting him to go to his physical therapist. Sometimes even that's a fight. But if, I was able to find a kind of therapist that, instead of sitting on an armchair and a couch, took him out to play basketball, or they went for a jog, or for, just kind of did something and they hung out like buddies, he's more likely to open up on a basketball court or, having a catch than in a traditional setting. And your website mentions even in-home options for family therapy. I think that's a really great way to get kids to participate when they may not be willing, because we've come to them now instead of forcing them to leave the house or saying, hey, let's go for ice cream. And then all of a sudden the car turns into your office instead. And now we've tricked them. What is that like, the in-home family therapy option?
Yeah, it's really actually great. We have mentors that will come into the home because there's lots of families who, for whatever reason, maybe don't have the accessibility to drive to an office. And an office is good, but it's it's an office, right? It's best if we can go into the environment because then we're working with the family. So in-home is pretty great. In-home, and especially can do as well a lot of virtual stuff as well. But in-home, to take them out, to do stuff, to see the system in its actual natural environment is the best way to interrupt those patterns that are dysfunctional. Because in the office, the reality is people put on their best behavior, right? They put on their social hats and stuff, where you go into their home and you see what's happening. You see these natural things come out. And if there's impatience or there's shame producing or whatever, we can really work to do that. And it's like you say, I'm going to talk about experience all day long. We experience life before then we have the cognitive ability to then reflect on that experience. So I always say to parents, have you ever talked to anybody into feeling safe? And they'll be like, yeah, I think I have. I'm like, no. You have to have the experience of feeling safe before then you can then cognitively reflect on feeling safe. So just like therapy, I always say, does a therapist come in and have them have an experience of what it feels like to be cared about? An experience of going to take a walk, play basketball. At that same time, that experiential activity takes place within a nurturing environment. That's what an in-home therapist should providing, and Embark does, is that we go create these wonderful experiences within the context of an absolutely reliable and predictable nurturing environment. That's different.
What if the kid still refuses to participate? Even if it's in home, in their safe place, and they're just adverse to the idea or just in defiant mode, and they run and hide in another room, refuse to come out of their room. I'm sure whatever worst case scenario in my head I can think of, whether about my own kids or from stories I've heard from other families, you've seen it or have seen worse. So how do you still help parents understand that, hey, it's okay, and here's what we're going to do? And you had mentioned sometimes you need to do something 8 times before that begins to take effect. So do I have that counselor come 8 times before I hope my kid comes out of his room or stops hiding under the couch?
Well, I would ask this is a really great question, because I call it the if-then stuff, right? Because I always like to ask parents, well, if you offer them these choices and if they don't take it, then what? Then what? Then you boil it down. So what I always say to parents is, one is take the child away, because parents oftentimes get held hostage by their kids.
Oh yeah.
And I call it the bullets. Well, what bullets are you giving them? And they're like, what? Well, what bullets are you giving them to allow them to hold you hostage? That's a great question. So what we need to do as parents, and our in-home therapists can do this, is one is we want to spend a lot of time with parents saying, what are the boundaries and the limits to live in your home that are non-negotiable? Most people want to connect and do all this wonderful stuff, but they actually don't know where they begin and they end. So in order to help not to be held hostage, they really need to outline, and we encourage parents to do this. I'm not going to be held hostage. Being held hostage as a parent is not safe. I have to know what's absolutely okay and not okay, our boundaries and our limits in this house. Now, if you exceed those boundaries, here's a good one. A suicide attempt is something that actually normally exceeds the ability for the parents to keep safety within the house. So what do? We take the child to a higher level of care because we love them. We take them to a higher level of care and get them the help that they need to ensure that there is safety. Now, if we can go through this process with the parents, we actually take that hostage holding away. Like if the therapist shows up and the child refuses, I don't want the therapist to be held hostage. Guess what? You can go into your room, but I'm going to stay close to you. I need to keep eyes on you. And there's lots of things that we can do that I'm not held hostage, that I can still let you know that I care about you. Because one is knowing that you're cared about is the first step. And what might that be? Me just following through with the boundaries. No. You don't go in and slam your door shut. Do that. No. I need to keep eyes on you. Yeah. In order to be able to do that, we have to set ground rules. I'm amazed at how many parents don't even have these basic non-contingent ground rules that go for anybody and everybody. Just like physical assault. Physical assault should be a no, right? That goes for anybody and everybody. That's a boundary. If you continue to hit me and we can't repair and improve our relationship, guess what's happening over time? We're going to ask you to leave the house because we can't guarantee that safety. Now, if we can repair it, we'd love to have you back in the house. That's great. Now, I happen to go through this all the time because my expertise is children coming to residential care and going to the intensive outpatient. Yeah, where adolescents are right on that fridge. Parents don't know if they can keep them safe in the house. We happen to be experts at that to help parents, because I'll say to them all day long, let's shore that up, because if you can do this from home, let's do it from home. I'm in no hurry to get your kid into more intensive treatment. I'd prefer them to stay home. So that's a long answer for let's not be held hostage. Let's start with, what are your boundaries and limits, mom and dad, that go for anybody and everybody? Most parents haven't had the time to go through that exhaustively to figure that out. So they do get held hostage, right? Oh, they're refusing therapy. That's okay. That's okay if you're so hurting or you're so scared that you don't want to talk to me. We don't have to talk to do therapy. What? Very little therapy is actually talking. We probably need another hour on this.
I know my mind is like circling with all the questions I still have, all the questions I imagine that everybody, as they're watching and reading the follow-up and watching this again later, will have.
We'll do a part B.
But this was fantastic. For our readers, this video will be available to you all the time. We will have a follow-up just with a little bit of a flesh out of some more information on our website within the next week. And if anybody has any further questions, please feel free to submit them, and we'll try to share those with Rob and with Embark as well. Rob, I can't thank you enough for being here with Laura and I today and answering all of these important questions and giving us answers to questions we didn't even know we had. I've learned actual helpful, actionable information here today, rather than just hearing the same old things. I feel like I read it in a lot of places, on podcasts and in different articles about things, things that I can take and use with my own family. So thank you. And I hope we get to do this again sometime soon.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.